everybody, and welcome to Oiko. I'm your host, DJ Gina, and we're coming to you live from KZSC Santa Cruz, perched on a hill in Crown College at UCSC with a great view of the Monterey Bay. This past weekend on campus was the Graduate Research Symposium, a presentation of much of the research that's been happening at this school. Usually, this talk show focuses on the life sciences, but I've branched out for this week to include psychology, history, planetary science, and yes, still some biology. First, Carver Beerson will talk about a new celestial body on the distant outskirts of our solar system, an oddly shaped rock further than Pluto. Then, Alina Larson of the psychology department will talk to us on how machine learning can influence human empathy and whether synchronizing our actions can produce positive feelings towards machines. Karen Tanner of the ecology and evolutionary biology department will talk on how salt marshes, indispensable to the Earth's carbon system, and the unique pressures placed on plants as the climate changes. Q Han of the history department will talk about environmental policy of China in the 1950s and 60s under Mao, and the different cultural significance of different species to the central government and the local government. And finally, Stephen Green will talk about Jewish food culture of Iowa, of all places, as the Jewish population grew and flourished in the early part of the 20th century, where delicatessens were the center of social lives. All this coming up next on Oiko. This is DJ Gina. Stay tuned.
So I'm Carver Beerson. I'm in the Earth and Planetary Science Department. I work with my advisor Francis Nimmo, who's also involved in the New Horizons mission, and also Xi Zhang on Venus atmospheric chemistry.
What is the New Horizons project?
So New Horizons is a spacecraft that was launched from the Earth in 2006 with its primary goal of being the first spacecraft to ever visit Pluto. We had the Voyager spacecraft back in the 70s and 80s do the initial exploration of the solar system. That's where most of our great images of Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus come from. But we never sent a spacecraft to Pluto before. And we didn't understand what Pluto or its neighbors out in the far edge of the solar system looked like. So New Horizons was going to solve that. It's a mission of exploration. So it flew past Pluto in 2015. And now it's continuing farther out in the solar system, exploring the Kuiper Belt. And we just flew past MU-69 on January 1st of this year.
Why is MU-69 as a space body? Because it's made of rock and ice, correct?
Yes.
So why is it more unique than, say, a comet or a moon?
It's a different class of object than a comet or a moon. So comets tend to be very small. They're about 1 kilometer in size. And we know a lot about comets because they come close to us. We can see them as they come into the inner solar system, and we can do a lot of work to study them there. Whereas MU-69 is about 10 times bigger than a comet, but it's about 10 times smaller than Pluto's large moon, Charon. So it's an intermediate to those two worlds, and a type of world that we haven't really explored out in the Kuiper Belt.
What shape was it?
So going in, we knew that there was something weird about the shape because we had watched it pass in front of several stars from the Earth by sending astronomers down to places like Argentina. So we initially thought it was going to be something like two spheres in contact with each other. But upon getting our data back, it looks like it's maybe more similar to two pancakes. It's very flattened out. And we're still trying to understand why it has that shape.
You mentioned you had several telescopes in Argentina. Can you explain how you use multiple telescopes to get an image of this object?
So what happened was that a team was assembled with a bunch of small telescopes, and everybody was flown down and spread out. And over the course of a very particular night, they stared at the same star and waited for MU-69 to pass in front of that star. And when it passes in front of it, it briefly blocks the light from that star to reach your telescope. And so at each telescope that was spread out, they measured exactly how long and when that star blinked out. And by reconstructing that, by essentially putting those different profiles on top of each other, we can get some idea of the shape and know exactly where MU-69 is. This was also really helpful for us in pointing the spacecraft to make sure that it was in the images as New Horizons flew past.
Well, you mentioned that this craft is just going to keep on going. How fast was it going again?
It's about twice as fast as a bullet.
Twice the speed of a bullet. That's really fast. So you can't stop it. It's going to continue on. Where's it going to go?
It's going to continue traveling out further and further in the solar system. And the spacecraft should be healthy for a number of years to come. So the question now is, can we find another object in its kind of path that it's traveling along to also explore on the way? We have a healthy spacecraft, we just need a target for it.
It seems like a very whimsical, almost fantastical sort of space mission. Like we just flung a spacecraft as far as we could and it's keep on going. Where's it going to go? That's what we have to find out.
Yep, and we knew we wanted to go to Pluto. So we were heading there, and then we're just taking the opportunities that come to us, and we're looking for more opportunities and trying to get the most out of this spacecraft. It's already there. We don't have anything else this far away with good cameras on board and the instruments to study these worlds in detail.
Is it still within its range of communications? And if so, how long will it be until it's too far and we can't talk to it anymore?
With how far New Horizons is from us right now, it takes about 6 hours for a signal we send from the Earth to reach New Horizons. But we can still relay data back and forth pretty well. I say pretty well, but the download rate from the spacecraft is about 1 kilobyte a second. So when it flew past MU-69 and gathered gigabytes of data, it's taken us a while to download all that from the spacecraft. And we still are downloading data and will be for months to come. I don't know when we'll be beyond the point that we're no longer able to communicate with the spacecraft, but we expect the spacecraft to still be healthy, functioning, and be able to work with it for at least a number of years to come.
My name is Karen Tanner, and I'm in Ingrid Parker's lab in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department.
And you're studying salt marshes. What is a salt marsh and why is it important for the environment?
Salt marshes are special habitats that exist along our coastlines, and they're very important in terms of protecting against sea level rise and storm surge, and they're also exceptional at storing carbon. They're actually better at storing carbon than pretty much any other ecosystems in the temperate zone. So they're very important to have, and we've lost a lot of them, so it's really important to try and restore them where we can.
You're studying plant cover. What was the premise of your experiment?
Yeah, we're looking at how we can get restoration plantings to perform better so that we can speed up restoration and also improve those outcomes. So there is a conceptual framework that says when plants are clustered together, we often think that they will compete for light and nutrients, but sometimes if conditions are really stressful, having plants nearby to you can be helpful. You can imagine like a plant that is all by itself in like a tidal current versus a cluster of plants. The plant that's all alone would more easily be washed away. So that's like one example of how this could work. So our premise was we have these existing salinity and moisture gradients in the ecotone, which is where the marine and terrestrial environments meet.
And by gradient, you mean closer to the ocean is a lot more salty and wet, and further away is more dry and less salty.
Yes, that is exactly right. Yeah, so in our upland areas, we're transitioning out of the tidal influenced zone into the upland. that area is going to be less moist. And then there's also these salinity gradients that can develop according to a lot of different factors throughout the year, including the presence of our Mediterranean summer. So as the year goes on, it gets drier and drier. Those areas that get infrequent inundation actually experience salinity concentration because the water all evaporates before the next inundation event.
And leaving the salt behind.
Leaving the salt behind, exactly. So we were trying to figure out whether we could use different planting strategies to help buffer abiotic stress, physical stress, from salinity and moisture, lack of moisture that the plants could be experiencing in the field. So we developed a tight and a loose planting pattern, and in the tight pattern the plants are close enough together they can help shade each other and slow evaporation rates and keep the soil temperatures lower, which makes for better growing conditions. So we thought that plants clustered tightly together would do better at higher elevations where it's drier and potentially the salinity is higher. And we put out a whole bunch of plots in 2017, and we tracked them for survival, and we also tracked percent cover and looked to see which of the planting patterns performed better. We actually found no difference.
Well, 2017 was one of the wettest years, 95th percentile of rain, right? So a lot of that dehydration stress would not have been present.
That's right. Yes. So, yeah, that super high rainfall year, we know that these salinity and moisture gradients are very responsive and dynamic to the last tidal event, the last rainfall event. So the fact that we got so much rain probably virtually eliminated stress gradients that might otherwise develop during a more average rainfall year.
So this experiment would benefit from being redone in a more normal rainfall year?
Absolutely, yes. We do think that it's still possible that we could see some differences in the plant interactions that occur across that elevation gradient, but we would need to do some additional testing in different rainfall years to see how that pans out.
Okay.
And I work with Jeannie Foxtree in the Spontaneous Communication Lab.
What is spontaneous communication?
So spontaneous communication is distinguished from prepared communication, where you might, like I just did, present a talk that you've had time to think about and even maybe prepare a script for. Spontaneous communication would be more like this right now, where we're having just a natural conversation without prompts. So I'm studying how people interact with others that they are set up to disagree with, and in this particular study I had people either interacting with a supposedly human or machine agent, and I had an interest in finding out whether synchronizing and moving in time with the human or machine agent would positively impact impressions of humanization and also persuasiveness from the other.
In other words, if a machine agrees with you, you're more likely to like it.
In a sense. So I set everybody up to interact with some agent that they disagreed with, either a human or machine. In fact, neither of them actually existed. But so they're set up to disagree initially because that already starts the dehumanization process. Like, you're thinking of the other as an outgroup member, and you start to think of it as less than human. That's an effect that's been demonstrated with humans, but not so much with machines. But that's kind of the line that my research is pushing in. I'm hoping to build more humanization and for both machine and human agents by having people interact with them in synchrony sort of tasks as a sort of intervention to produce humanization that isn't already naturally happening. Like, they aren't set up to like the robot or the human agent because they disagree with them, but will the synchrony task help them to build that rapport that starts them thinking in the line that this person or machine has these characterizations that are human-like.
What do you mean by synchrony test?
So the synchrony task that I had them engage in is a egg shaker rhythm task. So they were asked to either shake the rhythm, the egg shaker at the same time as the other that they were listening to on the headphones, or to try to produce a different rhythm than the one that they just heard. And other sorts of synchrony tasks have involved people walking in time with each other, or clapping in time, or moving their hand up and down, and that kind of thing.
What did your results suggest?
My results suggest that people do humanize humans more when they've participated in a synchrony task than when they haven't. But with machines, they actually humanize the machines more if they don't synchronize. So if they're prompted to do something creative and different from the machine, then they actually give the machine agent more positive ratings for humanization and also persuasiveness.
Oh, that's very interesting. I wouldn't think it would be like that.
Yeah, I definitely did not predict it would go in that direction. I predicted that synchrony would boost humanization scores for both humans and machines, but there was actually an interaction effect where the patterns were opposite for humans and machines. So, yeah.
Do you think it's because humans automatically identify with other humans and not with machines?
I think there's definitely an element of that, and also possibly people just find it demeaning, and if say you're working at McDonald's and you're flipping hamburgers, and you're working with a bunch of basically robots, you don't have a lot of creative input. You're told you have to flip it now, you have to move this here and at this point, and you're being told to do all of these sort of rhythmic things for a machine in machine time. And it's demeaning. It doesn't feel fulfilling. Whereas
it's rote. It's mechanic.
Yeah, exactly. People don't like being asked to do something mechanic, even though both of the stimuli for human versus machine were exactly the same. People just had the idea that this was produced by a machine. I don't want to copy it. It's not creative.
Okay, yeah. That's really interesting.
I know, it is pretty weird. I didn't expect that, but it makes sense.
Yeah. In the future, going forward with this research, where do you expect it to go?
I think that what I was hoping for, finding this pattern that either humans or machines could both be humanized through a synchrony task, I was hoping that would sort of set the groundwork for using machine agents as a proxy for humans, and sort of starting to study how we can rehumanize other humans that are in outgroups using machine agents instead, because it's not necessarily ethical to set somebody up to dislike somebody else who's coming into the lab, but it's easier to have them do that with a machine. But since we're seeing the opposite from what I was predicting, this would be a more interesting segue into research that's delving into how to create robots that people enjoy interacting with more, so more HRI type studies. So, for example, if you're having a person learn how to play a musical instrument with a machine as their tutor, which would be more affordable for most people than a private music tutor, then you don't want that machine or robot tutor to be saying, okay, I'm going to play a scale, now play exactly what I just played. It would be better for them to do call and response, say, I'll play these notes, and then you play the ones that should come next.
Okay.
And that would just sort of create this atmosphere of more creativity that would be less demeaning.
Not a world ruled by robots, but a world with robots.
Yes. So the robots are helpers. Yeah.
I'm from history department.
Can you tell me the premise of your study?
So the premise of my study is to rethink about the environmental protection history timeline of the People's Republic of China, because we have this overarching sentiment that China is ignorant, China is environmentally unfriendly. The history of PRC environmental protection follows the timeline of environmental protection laws, one in 1979, one in 1984, and one in 1988. And the Mao era that I'm studying, which is from 1949 to 1976, the death of Mao, has been traditionally conceptualized as the era of ignorance, the era of degradation. Chinese people didn't know what they were doing, they just kept destroying the environment. But the whole concept sounds to me like Ding Dong, the Witch's Dead in 1976, and now we begin our progress. But just in 3 years after Mao's death, they had the full-blown environmental protection law. So something might have happened during this time. So that was my initial question. So was Mao era merely an era of ignorance and environmental degradation, or could it actually be the beginning of PRC environmental protection?
And what did you find?
So I found that in 1950s, Chinese scientists actually had an intensive discussion with the Soviet Union. Mostly, they participated in international conferences together. They're translating journals together. So they were having active discussion about environmental science, which shows that China was not isolated or lagged behind as people normally thought. And they had these emerging ideas about the concern of pollution, the species extinction, natural protection, and the term ecology. In Chinese, we call 生态. So it shows that they're forming this concept that nature is a web. It's a complex web of different organisms. And these ideas actually slowly emerged to the central rhetoric, which led to the actual policy in China's first natural reserve in 1956, and the Soviet-inspired hunting regulations in 1962. I think hunting regulations is really important because they now discussed the ban of hunting offspring, or they banned certain poisons that could have destructive consequences. They were really worried that normal people didn't know the value of the wildlife, and they kept hunting them, even eating them. So they said, we really have to educate these normal people to know about the value of this wildlife species. So, I mean, this is a seed of the popular environmental education as well. My focus is more like how at the grassroots level, in the locals, it didn't really work.
So, what happened at the local level that made this environmental education not work?
We have to understand that the local bureaucrats were more sympathetic to local settings. They knew local people, and they cared about that. So when the central policies collided with the local people's livelihood, like with the hunters, for instance, they made a compromise. They banned the state language a little bit to create rooms for wildlife poaching. For instance, about the Siberian tiger, the central government wanted to protect them because they're beautiful, strong animals, internationally acknowledged. So they used the word population protection for Siberian tigers. But for local people, Siberian tiger was only useful for Chinese medicine. So the local government tend to use words like population containment, which has a very different connotation. They also complain that, tigers are eating people, killing livestock, they're dangerous. Of course, we don't want them to go extinct, but we don't want them to thrive either. So this kind of language bending is one of the reasons why the policy didn't really work. And we also need to think that the centralized policy of the People's Republic of China in the 1960s, the central bureaucrat didn't really care about the messy local economic settings. And I sometimes feel that they're really cold-blooded because they're blaming the locals so easily, like how can you eat wildlife without knowing its value? But I think it was 1962, we just had the worst famine in the world, so why are you so surprised that people were eating animals out of hunger? When this kind of strict policies landed in northeast China, the local government were juggling between the local people's well-being and the centralized policy. And a lot of times they made compromises favoring the locals, which was not really a good news to the local environment.
You mentioned that some animals were conserved, like the tiger. The tigers were conserved because they had symbolic status. They were symbols of strength, but they weren't necessarily the most ecologically important animals in the ecosystem.
Why do we focus on protecting the animals that are pretty and have only aesthetic value rather than the economic and environmentally acceptable animals?
I think that actually shows how different, like contrasting ideals affected the environmental policies, because the central government was really interested in symbolic political animals like giant pandas, like their national icon, and diplomatic animals was really important for China. They wanted to send animals to foreign nations and they enhance international relations. They even do that nowadays.
I think I read somewhere that all pandas are property of the Chinese government, and if we have them at like the LA or San Francisco Zoo, they're just on loan and they have to be returned.
Yeah, even if they have like children, they belong to China. I mean, that kind of nationalization of the animals were also important because, for instance, about the red crown crane, which was also really important political animals in the 1950s. Red crown crane, for instance, they crossed the border between Korea and China, which made them less valuable. So they became less and less valuable in the state policy, and Hamilton government didn't care about them because nobody really eats them or skins them. So we cannot really depend their fate on this changing political or economic situation. And the problem about the early conservation was that conservation was only part of the reason for the government to protect certain species. It actually makes the timeline of the 1980s meaningful because in the 1980s they were more concerned with the ecological value, environmental value of the animals. Red crown crane was back in the game as well in the 1980s, but in the 1950s and 60s they were having a very vulnerable fate, and which is not determined by their ecological value entirely.
And you were talking about how important food is in Jewish communities. How is it important?
It's important for various reasons. One of the most important reasons that I think is that it helps really establish tight-knit communities beyond what religious life or political life would have normally done. So my research looks at food both in entrepreneurial activity and food businesses, but also within the private home and through charitable functions such as dinners and picnics. The way that food was presented, consumed, and kind of came to be in these events and within these different environments really points to the importance of food within these communities.
You talked about entrepreneurial businesses. What do you mean by that?
So by entrepreneurial business, I mean people, especially Jewish individuals, who came to the Midwest, specifically in Iowa, and set up businesses that revolved around food. And this takes the form of restaurants, both kosher and non-kosher, delicatessens, grocery stores, bakeries, the list could really go on and on, but those are some of the more important ones. And what's important is not only that they're establishing a business venture for a Jewish individual and providing important things for a Jewish community, but they're also important places to gossip and kind of hang out and catch up and kind of get the latest news about the local Jewish community.
It's really a place for Jewish people to gather outside of the synagogue and outside of political rallies. And it not only serves a place of community for the Jewish people, but in the fact that it's a business, it brings kosher food and Jewish food to people that are not Jewish and exposes them to those cultures.
Definitely. And beyond the mingling of Jewish and non-Jewish peoples within these businesses, there was also events like kosher-style dinner parties between Jews and Gentiles, where a prominent Jewish individual, usually a food entrepreneur of some sort, would invite local politicians and other people who are important in the larger Iowa community into their home and kind of as like a sampling of what Jewish food was and where they could go and find these products should they want to try it some more.
What year range did you look at?
My year range is from 1890 to 1940. 1890 is important because that's when we start to see the shift away from German Jews to Eastern European Jews. And then by the time World War II starts to roll around, the Depression and World War II had kind of cut off immigration and also kind of fractured the communities, especially the really small Jewish communities.
Yes. Why did you choose Iowa?
I chose Iowa by accident, actually. So I was researching in New York about New York Jewish food, specifically deli businesses, and I came across some papers that was talking about the movement of New York entrepreneurs to Iowa and setting up these kosher bakeries and things like that. And so I kind of just followed the paper trail, so to say, and kind of really got interested in the communities there.
That's interesting. Can you talk about the anthropological factors in food and Jewish identity?
Yeah, so I am a historian by trade, but I also work with anthropological theories. One of the most important theoretical works that I draw on is David Sutton's work on anthropology, food, and memory. And that's kind of the way I see food playing a critical role in these communities.
Can you explain that concept of the food memory?
Yeah, so I kind of draw, like I said, off David Sutton's argument. And in that argument, it's this idea that no matter where you are in the world, if you've immigrated somewhere, if you've moved somewhere, if you've relocated, that food, especially comfortable food that you know and those tied to you culturally, can reproduce these images of belonging and cultural and individual identity that can kind of serve you no matter where you're at. If you're in a small Jewish community, let's say in Iowa, or a larger Jewish community in New York. So that's kind of the way that I see food working in that way.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that had a name. I just thought everyone liked mom's home cooking.
Yeah, that's definitely the way, at least that I see it. And speaking of mom's cooking, you actually see this kind of idea play out in the transmission of cookbooks and recipes that are being passed down between mother and son, mother and daughter, and how those continue in the community as well.
Do you think with the rise of the internet and recipe blogs, we're going to see a resurgence of Jewish food in Jewish communities?
Maybe so other places. I don't see that happening in Iowa, mostly because most of the Jewish residents who used to live there have now gone on to some of the larger places in Iowa, like Des Moines, or have moved on into larger urban centers such as New York and San Francisco. But I definitely still see really interesting work being done on recent and contemporary transmission of recipes and the building of communities through food in Jewish communities as well.